Before we get started, I just wanted to share something before I forget that Michael shared with me last evening. And it was something that had come across his, you know, social media presence throughout the day. And it says, "You're not working from home. You're at home during a crisis trying to work." And, that just really set with me because I think that's what's going on here. So I appreciate all of you spending a little bit of your morning with me. Um, and thank you, Lori, for helping coordinate all this and all of you for being here with me. There's two things that terrify me most in life. One, public speaking, and two, technology. So this is basically like my worst nightmare, but it's the very first time. So here we go. I'm just going to talk a little bit about self-love right now in this time because it's extremely important for us to be really tender with ourselves and patient with ourselves right now. And I don't know about you, but I get bombarded with resources and articles that are supposed to help us cope right now and give us tools to make us more resilient. And sometimes I think getting all the information in and of itself stresses me out. So I just wanted to sort of break down some of the concepts that have resonated with me throughout my professional and personal life the last few years, because I've spent many years looking at the science of trauma, but then I also get to look at the science of resilience, right? So what makes us resilient during difficult times? What helps us move through adversity? So right now, I want us to really think about the concept of compassion. Compassion is one of the pillars that has been identified through a century of research to really help us be more resilient. And so compassion for others really starts with kindness to ourselves. So I think that if we grow in any way during this global crisis, it will be through our ability to be compassionate, first with ourselves and then to others. Right? So self-care is obviously about taking care of our bodies and brains, right? Obviously, we need to get enough sleep. We need to try to eat decent and move around, right? It's important for us to move around throughout the day. I don't know if anybody read the article, watched the podcast that Lori shared in the weekly newsletter with Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a renowned child psychiatrist and medical doctor. If you didn't, please take the time to do that. It's full of so much important science around understanding our body's stress response system and what we need to calm ourselves when we're feeling sort of activated. And so right now, many of us are going to feel activated all the time because this is a confusing time. We've not been here before. We don't know what to expect. And so that insecurity, that lack of predictability, tends to make our stress response system always activated. So in that podcast, he talks about the need to move around 5 to 10 minutes every 30 to 60 minutes, right? And so we might think taking a long walk is really nice, and it is, but like he says, it's important for us to get up and move around 5 minutes every 30 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes every hour. So whatever that looks like for you is important to remember. So emotional connection is something we all need. Every human being needs to feel connected emotionally. Belonging is another pillar of happiness and joy and longevity and health throughout our lives. And so right now, this is a funny time, right? We are in human services work. I don't think any of us went into this work to work virtually. And so it's important for us to stay emotionally connected. Curiosity, being willing to see things in a new frame is important, being generous, and having the capacity to be self-reflective, which is not always a comfortable exercise, right? So self-care really starts with our ability to take perspective, right? And to be empathic. And we know from a lot of science and also from intuition that our experiences start to shape our perspective, right? All of our experiences are different. I love this image because it reminds us that we see things differently, right? Some of us might share values, we might share belief systems, but each one of us has an individual and unique life experience that starts to shape the way that we see and understand first ourselves and the world around us, right? And that's going to be very different from one person to the next. And I don't know about you, but I'm 44, so I've had 44 years to really strengthen my belief systems, my judgments, how I label things, and my habits, right? And so I have to be tender with myself when I'm being reflective about some of those sort of habitual ways that I see and understand myself and the world around me. And science is really helping us better understand sort of this connection between our brains and our bodies. For some reason, we separate these two parts of us, but science is really helping us better understand what is going on in our bodies and brains, particularly as it relates to stress, right? We know our autonomic nervous system operates unconsciously. It regulates all of the processes in our bodies. And it's important to remember that when we're feeling stressed out, our body responds to that automatically, unconsciously. And so until we get into the practice of noticing in our bodies what it feels like when we are starting to feel activated by stressors, it'll be very difficult for us to develop ways to start to calm our bodies down. Right, so the still face experiment video is a little bit difficult to watch. It's short, it's about 2 minutes. I love to use this video in almost any discussion I have, basically about anything. This one and the backwards bicycle brain video, which some of you have seen, to me pretty much summarize our human condition. So we're going to take a few minutes to watch this. It's a little painful, but remember, it's a research study.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. Baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So I love that video because, well, for several reasons. First of all, we have a tremendous amount of tenderness towards babies, right? And then every year we grow and evolve as human beings, we lose that patience, right? So, but the most important part of this video is that you can see very clearly that baby's stress response system activated in the presence of a perceived threat to her emotional safety, right? So our body's natural way of dealing with a threat to our safety is activated, whether it's a perceived or a real threat, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a physical threat or an emotional threat. And so in the video, you can see very clearly how quickly that baby uses everything within her power to try to navigate that perceived threat, right? And so, you know, she does everything she can, and she can't get the mom back. And so when the mom finally returns, though, what happens in the baby's body? She comes right back down to baseline, almost instantaneously, right? So what this video shows is a healthy stress response system doing exactly what it was designed to do to manage a threat, right, in your environment, right? And so I love this video because it reminds me, first of all, we don't have control over the way our bodies activate, right? Our body's autonomic nervous system, it functions automatically, unconsciously. We don't cue it to happen, right? And then certain things happen within our bodies when that system's activated. And so stress gets a bad rap. Stress isn't the problem. Stress is what keeps us alive, right? Stress can be tolerable in the presence of supportive relationships. The mom comes back, the baby's body comes back down to baseline, right? And she's able to engage. Toxic stress is a term that was coined by Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which has an amazing website. I'll share it with you later. That just means overwhelming stress, an overwhelming amount of stress when you don't have the buffer of strong, supportive, nurturing relationships, right? And so this is where we all come in, right, to play with one another, right? We have the capacity in all of our interactions with individuals throughout our days to provide that sort of salve that calms our body's stress response system, or to sort of fan the flames of somebody's natural response to feeling fear, right? So toxic stress really puts our survival brain in charge. We have to remember this. And there's a lot of jokes being made about this, explains why people are, you know, fighting over things like toilet paper, right? But it actually does explain a lot about our response to feeling out of control, right? And when we feel out of control, our survival brain kicks in and we lose contact with that prefrontal cortex, that executive brain that makes all the higher level decisions, right? So I love this little guy. He evolved to survive threats in his environment by puffing up, right? He or she, I don't know if they're gendered. But anyhow, he senses a threat in his environment and he puffs up. That's how he protects himself when he's feeling scared, right? Some of us shut down, right? This person gets a lot of attention because the way they have adapted to deal with stress is much more visible. It's typically dangerous. It's completely socially unacceptable, right? But it's important for us to remember that this is also a coping mechanism of feeling overwhelmed and out of control. And we all puff up differently, right? We all have adapted to deal with discomfort in different ways. And especially in this very difficult time, it's important for us to remember this, right? And to be really tender with ourselves and with others, and to sort of shift the perspective of how we see behavior as potentially a response to feeling threatened. It's not an excuse, but it helps us sometimes make sense over things that are really difficult to understand, right? So our prefrontal cortex, or that executive brain, the air traffic control center, however you want to think about it, is responsible for all of these functions. Reason, taking perspective, which is really another word for empathy in many ways. Thinking about the future, planning, organizing our thoughts. I don't know about you, but like I literally can't keep track of appointments right now. Like I write them down, I have them in my calendar, and 2 o'clock will roll around and I have a meeting with Lori and I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot. It's not an excuse for me being scatterbrained, but I think really recognizing that our bodies are going to be dysregulated right now, and that's going to impact, in many ways, our ability to really focus, right? And so, especially in education, it's important to remember that this part of the brain controls our impulses, right? And we all know and understand that in the work that you do with children who have typically endured a lot of relentless stressors, right? So the science tells us that connection, human connection, feeling safe in relationships, right, leads to feeling safe in our bodies, right? We cannot function optimally when we don't feel safe. And so resilience really isn't necessarily the ability to bounce back to a previous state that's better. Sometimes people don't have a previous better state. Often resilience is the ability to move through adversity, right? And so remembering that we're all not alone in this, we actually are all together in this, right? I am we are all experiencing this together, provides a little bit of comfort, right? So resilience, the research on resilience really shows us that relational wealth, strong supportive relationships are the single most important protective factor in our lives for lifelong health and well-being, but for also being able to calm ourselves in acute moments of stress, being able to express our feelings and emotions, emotional intelligence, right? Knowing how we feel in context to what's going on, being able to communicate that. These are skills that are built over time. They are not something we're born with, right? And so we have to practice being able to communicate effectively what we are feeling and what we need from others. Seeking help is also not comfortable. You know, I think a lot of us can relate to this. It's not comfortable to ask for help because we live in a culture that really is quite critical of vulnerability, right? And so I watched like 20 TED Talks on conflict resolution one day. That's another story I'll share with you later. But anyhow, one of the underlying themes was, in order to deal with conflict, we have to be willing to be vulnerable. And we can only be vulnerable in the safety of a relationship where we feel seen and heard, right? And so again, we have the ability to create that environment for the individuals that we're engaged with throughout our days. Being able to feel like you can do something for yourself is huge. And that is going to be a vulnerability for us right now. Being optimistic is really important. Being able to reframe our situation in a positive light is truly one of the 3 most important factors in joy and resilience and happiness. Being able to reframe our situation, being able to have a sense of humor, being able to experience gratitude, and of course, being compassionate, right? So the Harvard study on adult development, if you've never looked into this, I'll share a link. It's really interesting. It started in 1938, and so it's a longitudinal study really looking at what are some of the factors throughout our lives that lead to not only physical health, but emotional health and happiness. And what that study shows us, along with a tremendous amount of scholarship and research around joy and happiness, is that, of course, belonging is one of the foundations. This is sort of a mirror of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which was developed in the 40s. And we know now that, of course, we need to be able to meet our basic needs. But one of those basic needs is feeling a sense of belonging, right? And so fortunately, although we're living a virtual life, we do have each other, and we have stayed connected from the very first day that this has started. Although that might be exhausting in different ways, it is a huge protective factor for us. And so this is a really sweet book. It's a great gift. It's a lot of interactive, fun, science-based activities that help us explore our values, our strengths, and then it gets into a lot of fun science around how to stay healthy and regulated. And so the author in this book, she realized that all of the chemicals that need to stay balanced in our brains in order for us to function optimally spell the word dose, right? And so how can we, through natural healthy ways, get our daily dose, right? So dopamine is activated by pleasure and reward. So getting shit done really helps us feel good, right? It releases dopamine in our brain. Oxytocin is going to be difficult for any of us who live alone, right? But it's activated by physical touch, consensual physical touch, I would add there. But I think it's really interesting from a scientific perspective to understand the function of oxytocin. Oxytocin is typically associated with mother-infant bonding, breastfeeding, and mother-infant bonding. But oxytocin is part of the stress cocktail of chemicals that's released into our body when our system's activated, along with things like cortisol and adrenaline. Oxytocin is released into our body. And what it tells our body to do is seek the support of another human being. And when we do that, and we receive that safe, non-judgmental support, right, our body floods with more oxytocin and calms our body's stress response system. So we saw that very clearly in the still face experiment video, right? The mom comes back, the baby's body comes back down to baseline, right? Serotonin, obviously we need to rest and reset, and then we need to get out and walk, stretch, breathe, do whatever it is that gets our heart rate up a little bit and gets our bodies moving, right? So this is the most woo-woo thing I'll say this morning, but deep breaths are really like love notes to your body. We have to be able to breathe in order to quickly calm our body's stress response system. So this is where this whole like movement around mindfulness is emerging in our society right now, because mindfulness is just paying attention to the present moment without judgment, right? And so breathing, paying attention to the present moment without judgment. And so deep breaths really are like love notes to our body. And so I encourage you all to keep being awesome. I wanted to share a little bit of a video with you.
What if it's too hard? What if it's too rough? What if it's too tough? What if you're just too young? What if you're not good enough? Why? Because I believe in you. Believe in yourself. Tell me why.
So we'll push through this and we'll do it together. And I'm really grateful to be experiencing this with all of you. So thank you so much for your time.